I've been building up to this video for a little while now, and it's also evolved quite a bit beyond its original script concept. So, 6 months ago, I reinvented this channel with Rathalos, and talked in that video quite a bit about how good his fight became in Rise. And almost 2 months ago, I discussed the idea that perhaps some of the big flagship monsters should take a step back in the next game, and why I thought that wasn't necessarily the best idea. In that video, I talked about the potential precedent that could be set for the major roster mainstays that I saw possible by how good Rathalos was in Rise. Now today, with a much better script writing ability and with a desire to focus on this subject solely itself, I want to talk about Monster Hunter Rise and Sunbreak's incarnation of the King of the Skies, and what I personally believe to be the single most important batch of attacks and combat changes that Rise brought to the table, and what they could mean for other veterans of the monster roster that we may have become a bit too familiar with after all of these years. We're all pretty used to Rathalos by now. He's in every single Monster Hunter game, and his changes from the original title in 2004 all the way up to, say, World have been fairly gradual and understated. It took a little bit of time, but his combos started to become a bit more elaborate. He would come to spend a little less time hovering out of reach of Blade Master weapons, and they would start to give him a few more interesting things to do here and there with his fire and his claws and his tail, and these changes come one at a time from game to game, slowly ironing him out. A little less obnoxious here, a few more added options there, a bit of extra speed, some new combos, some inspiration from some of his variations, etc., etc. He certainly became better, but for a very long time, I felt that he was never a particularly exceptional duel, and I think that that's opinion that a lot of us probably had. These changes amounted to a quality sum total package for sure, but oftentimes these new moves and fight improvements were so average and so drip-fed that they didn't leave lasting impacts on me each individual time these upgrades happened. It took a little bit of looking back and comparing World's Rathalos to, say, Freedom Unite's Rathalos for me to actually properly see how much he had changed. There were even some attacks here and there that I thought were introduced in one game, turns out they were introduced in another. My point being, Rathalos was able to evolve with the times, certainly, but I would say that Rathalos' fights over the generations served more to dictate the average increase in Monster Hunter combat design as a whole than they did to actually grant Rathalos a legendary battle in of itself. His pedigree and position within Monster Hunter is what kept him relevant as his gameplay remained average, and he constantly was utilized as a measuring stick for new monsters again and again and again and again. Though a striking yet simple wyvern that stood as a living, breathing representation of Monster Hunter's simultaneously grounded and natural, yet somehow also fantastical and personality-filled creature design, Rathalos' fight, I would say, never really dared to bypass a 6.5 or 7 out of 10 in terms of quality and fun factor at its very heights. At least, that was the opinion I held. You're, of course, welcome to adore or loathe his old fights, and even the Rise one. That's fine. I realize now, looking back, that Rathalos did absolutely have a sum total of decent new changes and overhauls and tweaks granted to him throughout the years. But these alterations were a bit easy to overlook. The complete package was getting there, but it was missing the coup de grace. It was missing that extra slab of meat to really kind of cement how good this monster could be. And then Monster Hunter Rise and Sunbreak happened. Rise and Sunbreak made two excellent choices. First and foremost, Rathalos' aerial combat was massively overhauled in Rise. They doubled down on the King of the Skies moniker by simultaneously increasing his mid-air attack roster, expanding his in-flight combos, downsizing the amount of empty time where he would flap around not doing anything or hover out of reach, more evenly divvying up his time on the ground, and creating more combo chains where he would come back to the ground after being in the air. What really gets fixed up here is the tempo. See, I have found that my least favorite monsters in the franchise, or at least my least favorite fights, are those that specialize in wasting time. Monsters that deliberately try to stay away from you, deliberately try to create as much distance as possible, or constantly try to use quakes, roars, and wind to stagger lock you. Or monsters who spend lots of their time flying, denying you much of any access to their weak points, whilst also buffeting you with wind and trying to stay away from you. But Rathalos' combat design in Rise shows that flying wasn't necessarily the issue. I think that up until recently, they simply didn't really know what to do with it. I fought Rathalos in Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate and Rise Sunbreak back to back, and here's the best way I can put this. In Generations, and I would say quite a bit of the Monster Hunters that came before it, I think the developers made the mistake of treating Rathalos flying too similar to how he fights on the ground, as if the two were interchangeable. For some sections of the fight, Rathalos will maintain flight simply hovering above the ground, maybe reposition here and there, throw out his flying charge, talon swipes, and fireballs here and there. The move pool is limited, the combos are short, and he can spend a decent chunk of seconds either keeping any significant weak points away from you, swooping up and away out of reach, and or not really doing all that much, just kinda flapping around and meandering. Also, monsters still had those 60-degree turn angles back in GU, which meant he might spend a second or two just kinda hovering in midair while he's trying to turn around to get you. This isn't horrifically crafted combat against a winged opponent, but I found there to be a noticeable amount of dead air, a lack of variety, a lack of satisfying targetable body parts, save for maybe the tail to hit. While Rathalos flies in this game, I find myself just kind of waiting for him to come down, because I find his combat less engaging and my damage opportunities less satisfying than when he is grounded. He doesn't dedicate enormously disproportionate quantities of his fights to prolonged flying like this, but when he does go up in the air, I do not find it exhilarating. Rise is something very interesting. I think Rathalos might actually fly more in Rise than he does in Generations Ultimate, but I found it far, far more engaging. Now, why is that? Rathalos is absolutely ferocious in the air now, broadening his arsenal whilst in flight and improving upon how he wields it. There is considerably less downtime with Rathalos while he's in flight in Rise. Not no downtime, but way less. There are still moments where you get to just kind of whack at his claws in midair. Those opportunities are more often than not granted after one of his larger attacks that he takes longer to recover from. What I love here is that Rathalos is not very keen to waste your time, and you can kind of almost see the tactical brain of this animal as you fight him. Let's look at a few combos. You're right up in Rathalos' face. He creates distance with a parting shot fireball as he takes the air. Very common move. The second the flames and smoke clears, he's at a nice distance, comes flying in, strafes the ground with a flamethrower, crosses up past you, and then comes swinging in with the talons. Lands. Whole combo takes about 5 seconds. And let's take a look at this one. Less eventful takeoff and gives kind of a passing shot with his talons while flying way out. Gains distance, launches off that stray fireball shot, and then immediately follows up with a full-on talon strike. Lands. Again, about 5 seconds. Here, creating distance isn't necessarily a tactic Rathalos uses to defend himself and prolong the battle by keeping himself away from you. More so, it is a stratagem that zones out the hunter, forces them to react to oncoming projectiles, and then uses that reaction time as an opportunity to follow up to get in a heavier hit and close that distance, bringing the monster back within striking range for you and kind of resetting the fight. In fact, Rise uses this tactic of utilizing distance clearing and projectiles as a way to bait hunters into leaving themselves open to a rushing up follow-up attack a couple of times. I find this to be impressive combat design. A lot of the old Monster Hunter games would have monsters use charges as attacks and as ways to create distance, but for the sake of creating distance and really kind of nothing else. Sometimes requiring that hunters chase it all over the arena, spending a lot of time sheathing and unsheathing weapons and pursuing the opponent as it beelined from one corner to the other. Some were worse offenders than others, and this trend definitely got better as the games went on, but it was something that I found to be obnoxious back when I was playing games like Freedom Unite and Try. Here, with Rathalos in Rise, distance is an opportunity, a piece of the puzzle, a means to an end. Yes, obviously these are pre-programmed video game enemies, but once you kinda allow yourself to be taken in and immersed, you can almost kinda see the Rathalos' brain functioning, bamboozling opponents with an attack from the air, forcing them to roll or to block, flying out to a range where he's totally safe, baiting hunters into protecting or evading again, and using that distance and forced reaction to come crashing back in to try and land the more decisive blow. He peppers and disorients his target, flies past, around, and behind, keeping up these minor distractions, all in an effort to successfully land the one critical hit that he really wants. It's kind of genius, really, reinterpreting these tools in a monster's arsenal in a way that allows them to take advantage and reset the fight back in their favor, with them having the advantage, but also putting them back in your face so they're not far out and you have to chase after them. I'm sure there are other examples that can be pointed out too within Rise and probably in other games too, and feel free to leave some favorites in the comments, but this video is mostly about Rathalos. And more than ever with him, I can feel that battle experience in his mind, see that mastery, get in his head, understand his game plan to the extent that the limitations of his programming allows. The next aspect of Rathalos in Rise and Sunbreak I want to talk about are his flamethrower attacks. Now, these are originally what the whole video was going to be about. Before I really sat down and worked on this script, my major point with this video was gonna be that these new flamethrower attacks made such a profound impact on making Rathalos' fight more interesting, more varied, and how a nice flashy new jumpstart for Rathalos that brings eyes back to his fight could be an effective strategy for a lot of the roster mainstays. A way to bring their fights back into the public consciousness, make them new again, make them not feel as if they're just kind of a bump in the road, something to be there for nostalgia, something you're just trying to get through so that you can get to the new monsters, making the mainstays feel new again. And I am glad that the script expanded and evolved, because that whole section I was talking about with Rathalos' in-flight game plan, I think is just as important as this section about the new attacks. But these new attacks are still pretty important to cover. These flamethrower moves are more immediately impressive and eye-catching, but not as full of depth. The frosting on the cake, the bow on the present, the wow factor, the pièce de résistance, if you will. The single-shot fireballs, claw swipes, charges, and tail sweeps are all expected moves of his now. Attacks we've seen for years, and with few improvements on them here and there. Those have been nice, but Rathalos firing off these full power, ground singeing, lingering flame leaving, full body encompassing streams of flame in his wake as he strafes the arena. Still pretty and awesome the 100th or so time you see it. I understand why they never had Rathalos do these kinds of moves before. Rathalos having fairly limited fire breath abilities allowed for the firepower of early generation Elder Dragons like Teostra and Fatalis to seem far more impressive with their firepower by comparison. However, with how enormously powerful those two have become nowadays, upping Rathalos' fire breathing ability to full-on sustained dragon breath doesn't really close that gap all that much and make Teostra and Fatalis feel less special. Not really. Big cool flashy attacks aren't quite as mechanically detailed as combative strategy overhauls, but they can make a fight feel more memorable, more fun to deal with if said attacks are implemented well, and they simply just leave a strong, lasting impression. I mentioned earlier that I had some of Rathalos' older moves a bit jumbled in relation to where and when they were implemented. Not these. I absolutely remember Rathalos' fight in Rise. I look forward to engaging in it every time I throw up a quest with him in it. I get that little rush of excitement when I see him up in the air and drawing his head back to let loose an absolute geyser of fire. It's never not fun. I still to this day remember the first time I fought Rathalos in Rise, expecting, you know, a new move or two, expecting decent enough, old and mostly reliable with not a fresh coat of paint, but like a coat of paint in the spots where the paint was starting to chip away in a couple of places. And I came out the other side legitimately impressed and mildly taken aback by just how much better he was in Rise compared to every single other incarnation of his battle. And I didn't really know why at the time, but sitting down to piece this script together as well as gathering the footage for this video has really helped to solidify my thoughts. So now I've talked your ear off about how Rise and Sunbreak made Rathalos so fantastic, let's talk about some of his contemporaries. And as I've said, I've touched on this topic before. I consider this somewhat of a sequel video to my discussion on whether or not the classic monsters need to sit out more frequently to keep them fresh and to make them not so repetitive in the minds of those of us who have played most of these games. I think Rathalos shows us that leaves of absence are not necessarily the answer, though yes, roster rotation wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. It's not the end of the world as some of the classics sit out a game or two. It's fine. Now, to grant monsters like Tigrex, Nargacuga, Diablos, Rathian, Rajang, to list a few, I would say, really big examples of commonly recurring monsters from the first and second generations that could use an overhaul, would be a decent amount of work and resources on the developers' end to put into these older veteran monsters, admittedly. However, with the franchise going through a pretty major overhaul with World, and a lot of those growing pains being tended to and new bones for the franchise starting to sit in pretty well with the 5th generation, Monster Hunter might be in a pretty good place to really kind of start to play around with how its new and old monsters fight and try to enhance the tactics and interactions here and there. Rathalos serves as a pretty excellent template for what we can do with these classic monsters, and actually, he's not even really the only one. Zinogre tends to get some prominent moveset enhancements, as well as some minor alterations to how his charge-up mechanic works fairly frequently. Teostra has his shifting blast and fire states that alter the properties of his moves that come with his changing between element and status. And Kushala Daora got a nice big massive overhaul to his game plan in Rise that eliminated an absolute ton of frustrating tactics and gimmicks that he utilized in World and Iceborne. So we are already gradually seeing prominent and distinct overhauls for some of these old monsters that I think reinforce the point I'm trying to make here. Let's do a little bit of brainstorming for fun. Diablos. Diablos is in a decent place coming out of Sunbreak. He's had a few solid new attacks added to his arsenal, makes for a more fun encounter than he usually was, wastes a lot less time with his charging all over the place, kind of like what I was talking with Rathalos and his flying earlier. But I think he's lost a good chunk of menace. He doesn't dig quite as much as he used to, and doesn't have too much variety going into or out of it. What I think we can do here is a few things. Perhaps give him like various dig speeds and or delay his emerging up out of the ground. Psych out the player a little bit, scare him a little by having the tunneling Diablo sometimes take its time and sometimes come rocketing towards the player at breakneck speed. Make it look like he's coming right for you only to sharply veer off in another direction and make you second guess his attack angle. Have him make sure you're paying attention to how fast he's moving. And I say, we should give him more options when he emerges up out of the ground. Perhaps slightly alter the tells of the sand clouds he kicks up to indicate at which angle he'll emerge from. Dust seems to be pouring at like kind of a right angle from you. That means Diablos is going to lunge to the side and come rushing back in to try and spear you on your flank. You got maybe an extra big cloud of dust. That means Diablos is going to try and go overhead, leaping up extra high to come crashing down on you. Give him more to do while he's submerged, and give him subtle tells so that a properly observant player will be able to read the oncoming attack direction before he comes up out of the earth. Have him moving fast, keeping the players on their toes, and always needing to pay attention to the nuances of his underground activity. Kind of like how, if you memorize Kieran's head sweep patterns, you can very easily read his lightning attacks and plan your counterattack. Alright, Tigrex. Tigrex is a very conceptually simple monster, which makes him a little tough to build on, but we can work with what we have. Tigrex got a neat combo ender in Rise where he'll culminate a series of charges with a 360 spin to cover himself after his charge string ends to protect himself. I think we can implement this spin in mid-charge combo. Tigrex has too much forward momentum to be really agile, and with faster hunters, it can be pretty easy to just kind of wait out his charges as he needs a bit of time to turn himself around. And we have much better reaction time, so we can anticipate and move out of the way much easier than we used to in some of the old games like Freedom Unite. Want to make Tigrex scary again? Have him use, like, little half spins to maintain and redirect that momentum. Give him nice, quick pivots using smaller versions of his 360 spin to let him change angles way faster and reinstate that terror that is Tigrex's unstoppable onslaughts. And also, for the love of God, buff the radius on his damage-inducing roar back to where it was. Or even bigger, sure. It is unacceptably small in 5th generation Monster Hunter. Also, I'm cautious to give Tigrex too many new ways to implement his roar into his fighting, as that is supposed to be Brute Tigrex's gimmick, but you could perhaps do a less effective incarnation of Brute Tigrex's charging roar, where Tigrex will say maybe like skid to a halt after a charge combo and let out one of his roars as a way to damage opponents too eager to capitalize on the end of his attack string. This next one falls a bit beyond the topic of this video and maybe goes into even more speculation as to what they could do to overhaul combat in Monster Hunter. But if we want to get like really wild here, and we want to get back to monsters deeply ingrained in their environments, kind of like what World was starting to do, and using it to their advantage, a solid choice for a monster like Nargacuga, or, you know, perhaps maybe Kezu, these kind of stalker ambush predator type of monsters, would be to allow them to stalk you for a little while, staying off the trails after picking up your scent, and lunging from unseen areas, initiating the fight on their terms, darting up onto trees and into branches to create distance before leaping back down. Imagine like a forest map with a nice thick dark canopy of tree leaves that Narga could leap up into and come lunging out from in an entirely different location, and all you have are these like slight quivers in the branches and falling leaves acting as the indicator for where he is. And I'm sure we can all go on and on with a whole bunch of possible ideas for our favorite monsters, but I don't want to go on forever. The point is, there are a million different ways we can reassess and improve on the tactics, the showiness, the mind games, the advantages and interactions for the monsters in these games. Rathalos in Rise in Sunbreak has shown us what it looks like when the developers make these animals look like they're thinking beings. What the possibilities are when the monsters are given this illusion of having problem-solving abilities. And Rathalos has shown us that all it takes is just the right new kind of moves and the proper shot of adrenaline and the correct alterations to how the fight plays out to make the old feel young again. Monster Hunter Rise showed us what it looks like when the sky is the limit for we hunters. I'm hoping that our next adventure does something similar for our adversaries. Drop a comment down below, tell me what kind of overhauls and alterations you'd like to see in some of your old favorites. And remember, I am looking to hit 5,000 subscribers before January 10th, 2024. 1 year to the day that I started uploading to YouTube. And if you find yourself enjoying this channel and you're sticking around but aren't subscribed yet, why not hit subscribe? I'd really appreciate it. I will talk to you phenomenal individuals later. See you around. Shoutouts to all the patrons, and special shoutout to Nihilist Chimerax, Pico Plush, and Datboy Doindading. Thanks, guys.